And in that same letter to Pliny, Pliny says, okay, in this group of Christians I've heard about, their leaders are 2 female slaves they call deaconesses. Now, this is really early. This is before the church exists, right? There's no church structure yet. And who is leading the local congregation of Christians? 2 slave women. That's an interesting moment.
What do you think about people who say that Jesus never even existed? Do you think their claims should be taken seriously? Let's take a look at what Lex Friedman and this historian had to say about some of that. And stick around into the end, because I'm going to give some advice on top of this that is really going to help.
Jesus was born during the rule of Emperor Augustus.
Yep. Which is kind of neat that, really influential people in the realm of political events and religious events coexisted. What are the odds?
I mean, yeah, there's certain moments in history where just a lot of interesting, powerful people come together and make history. And he was crucified under Emperor Tiberius' rule.
Yep.
Why were the ideas of Jesus seen as a threat by the emperor?
The thing that causes conflicts between the Romans and Christians is a little bit strange. It's all with this, where the Romans had a tradition of, on the emperor's birthday, sort of saying a prayer, basically wishing him good luck. Okay, but technically it's in the form of sacrificing to that part of the emperor that might become divine after his death. So to the Romans, this is the equivalent of a patriotism act, saying, the Pledge of Allegiance or something to the country. But of course, to Christians, this is worshiping another god. And I think there's almost a failure of communication here, that the Romans just, at least initially, didn't quite understand this is really problematic for these people, because they're coming from a polytheistic perspective where, everybody has different gods, so what? This isn't a religious problem. This is a political one. That why won't you send good wishes to the emperor? If you're a loyal Roman, this is something you should want to do. And many of the early Christians, I think, would have been fine with that, but it took the form of what they were asked to do was to basically worship another god. And that was the sticking point. And this is where I think movies have kind of warped some of our images of Roman history, that Hollywood loves to depict very early Christians, and I'm talking like first 200 years here after the ministry of Christ, as a group that all the Romans were obsessed with, that they were constantly trying to persecute and all this. And honestly, I think the Romans at that point were more just sort of indifferent or didn't know what was going on. And if you look at some of the primary sources of that time, I mean, there's this very famous letter by a guy named Pliny, who was a Roman governor of a province in the east, and he has the habit of writing letters to the Roman emperor at the time, who was Trajan, every time he had a problem with being governor. And so this is great. This is the 2 highest governmental officials in the Roman world sort of hammering out policy between them, right? The emperor and one of his governors. And so this is about 100 years, 100 AD about. And Pliny says, hey, emperor, I had this issue. I had these people come before me called Christians. I don't quite know what to do with them. What should my policy be? And here's what I know about them. And what he knows is almost nothing. I mean, it's this almost comic, like garbling. And, they have this weird thing where they get together on some day of the week and they sort of swear oaths to one another not to do bad stuff, which is, of course, his garbled understanding of the 10 Commandments, And then they have breakfast together and they eat food, and this is communion, but he doesn't get that that's what's going on. And so he's really ignorant. But I think that the broader point is, okay, this is one of the best educated, best traveled Romans who has the most experience in the empire, has been all over the empire. If one of the best educated, most widely traveled guys really doesn't know much about them, that kind of suggests that not many people did at this point in time.
At this time, it was a fringe movement that really did.
Very fringe. I mean, it was one of, hundreds of little mystery religions the Romans sort of thought of them as. And these are, religions that have some sort of revealed knowledge and that appeal, sort of make more personal appeals to people. Now, stepping back from this in a broad way, I think you can say that Christianity really was different in some ways and had some things that maybe the Romans should rightfully have viewed as a threat. I mean, the Romans are people very focused on this world, right? Citizenship, what you do. Christianity, in essence, has a focus on the next world. So this world isn't as important as what you're setting yourself up for. And even worse, from a Roman perspective, I'm kind of saying, okay, if I were a Roman, Romans are all about making distinctions between people: citizen, non-citizen, man, woman, free, slave. Christianity comes along and says, in God's eyes, you're all equal. Now, that's a pretty problematic idea if you're deeply invested in Roman hierarchy. And I think it is no surprise that among the earliest converts to Christianity are women and slaves, and in particular, female slaves. Now, who are they? They're the people at the rock bottom of the Roman hierarchy of status, right? Which the Romans are obsessed with status. But here's a religion that says that doesn't matter. And in that same letter to Pliny, Pliny says, okay, in this group of Christians I've heard about, their leaders are 2 female slaves they call deaconesses. Now, this is really early. This is before the church exists, right? There's no church structure yet. And who is leading the local congregation of Christians? 2 slave women. That's an interesting moment, and that's not necessarily the image we get of early Christianity. But you can see how for people in this social structure, that would be very appealing to them. And in some ways, yeah, it is sort of a threat to the Roman system because they're challenging it. Now, the irony is, of course, 300 years after the life of Christ, the emperor converts to Christianity, and another 100 years later under Theodosius, it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. So all of a sudden you have this flip-flop where now the state itself is not just converted to Christianity, but actively promoting it, and now persecuting pagans. And the reason the emperors do that is one of the biggest problems for emperors at that point in time is legitimacy. That there's tons of civil wars where you have lots of different people saying, I'm emperor. So lots of generals declaring themselves emperor. Now, under a polytheistic religion, that's just, you're all just fighting, it doesn't matter. But if you say there is only one God, then if that God picks someone to be his emperor, they're the only legitimate emperor, right? So there is a real advantage to emperors now becoming Christian, because if they can say, we're now a Christian empire, and there's only one God, and I'm the guy that God picked to be emperor, that means all these other people claiming to be emperors are illegitimate.
I must admit, if I'm discussing some of the nuances of Christianity with somebody and they say, well, Jesus didn't even exist, I usually just end the conversation and politely walk away. Why? Because I don't even know how to take that claim seriously. Even Bart Ehrman, a very, very large skeptic of Christianity, will say that Jesus obviously existed. Now, in his opinion, there's other ways to debunk the Christian religion, but to say that Jesus didn't even exist, well, he says to people who are fans of his that they shouldn't be taking that road because they just sound like ridiculous, silly people. And to be quite honest, they do. That's obviously somebody who has not seriously considered these matters whatsoever. Now, if their claim or their pushback is that Jesus was not some miracle worker, definitely not the Son of God, okay. That's a separate conversation, and that's some fair pushback. But to say that he didn't even exist, honestly, if you're in a debate with somebody like that, I would probably just recommend politely walking away. And here we have, again, more evidence that this man was obviously a real human. I don't think people realize, especially if they haven't taken a larger view of history, the massive cultural evolution that happened in this area of the world at this time. I mean, you had the conversion of hundreds, if not thousands upon thousands of Jews to Christianity at this time after Jesus' death. This thing shook the world, and it shook it good. And often people don't realize that the effects of this are still reverberating around the world today. Christians have largely been responsible for hospitals, for universities, for the ending of slavery in the civilized world, for giving equal rights to females and other groups, saying that we are all equal. This movement shook the world to its core, in tangibly good ways, I might add. I have not met a single person that would argue against the fact that equal rights for people is a good thing, that a poor beggar has the same equality under the law as the rich CEO. That tradition and those laws that we have here in North America, comes purely from the Christian tradition. And it's so funny to me that the vast amount of people criticizing Christianity have no idea that they're standing on that foundation. And that brings us to the final question you need to ask yourself. If some of these things that have come from Christianity are justifiably good things, can goodness come from a lie?